year-old boy who was building a house with his own hands. But what happened a year later silenced them. Subscribe, share this video, and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The kitchen smelled faintly of instant coffee and toast, the kind of scent that lingered in small homes where mornings were always rushed. The sun was only beginning to push through the thin curtains, casting pale streaks of light across the scuffed linoleum floor. 13-year-old Jamal sat at the small table, hunched over a battered notebook. His pencil moved quickly, scratching lines and angles across the page with a precision that seemed far beyond his years. He was sketching again, as he had every morning for the past few weeks, blueprints for a house that only existed in his imagination. His mother, Tanya, moved quickly through the cramped kitchen, tying her apron around her waist as she checked the time on her phone. She worked mornings at a cafe downtown and evenings cleaning offices, her shifts so long that Jamal rarely saw her except for these quiet slivers of dawn. Her hands were dry and rough from constant scrubbing, her shoulders slightly hunched from exhaustion. Yet, when she glanced over at Jamal, a small, tired smile tugged at her lips. "Still working on that little house of yours?" she asked gently, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. Jamal nodded without looking up. "I'm fixing the roof line," he said, erasing a line and redrawing it. "I think it'll look better with a slope so rain won't pool." There was something in his voice, a certainty, a determination that didn't belong to a boy his age. Tanya watched him for a moment longer, her smile softening, though her eyes carried that familiar shadow of worry. She loved his dreams, but she also knew how unkind the world could be to boys like him, especially in their neighborhood where ambition often withered under the weight of reality. "You'd better finish your oatmeal before it gets cold," she said finally. Jamal set his pencil down reluctantly and spooned a few bites of oatmeal into his mouth. He could barely taste it. His mind was already outside, on the overgrown backyard behind their house, the uneven patch of land where he imagined his little house would stand one day. When Tanya left for work, pressing a quick kiss to his forehead, Jamal packed his sketches into his worn backpack and slung it over his shoulder. He stepped out into the cool morning air, the chain-link fence rattling faintly in the breeze as he walked down the cracked sidewalk toward school. Their street was quiet except for the distant sound of a barking dog and the faint hum of traffic from the freeway. He could see the peeling paint on the houses, the sagging porches, the broken blinds and windows that hadn't been replaced in years. This was the world he knew, a world where dreams were often too expensive to afford. At school, Jamal sat in the back of the classroom, his sketchbook open discreetly as he added measurements to his drawings. The teacher, Mr. Raines, droned on about fractions at the front of the room, but Jamal was far more interested in the geometry of rafters and walls. When the bell rang for lunch, he gathered his things and headed to the cafeteria, where he made the mistake of pulling out his notebook to review his plans. A couple of boys from his class, Marcus and Trent, leaned over his shoulder, their laughter sharp and cruel. "What's this?" Marcus snatched the notebook from Jamal's hands, flipping through the pages. "You building yourself a dollhouse?" "It's not a dollhouse," Jamal said, reaching for it, but Trent held it out of reach, smirking. "Look at this. He's got, real blueprints. Man, who do you think you are, some kind of architect?" Marcus sneered. A few other kids at the table snickered. Jamal felt his face burn as he snatched his notebook back and stuffed it into his backpack. "You'll see," he muttered, his voice low but steady. "One day I'll build it." Their laughter followed him across the cafeteria like an echo. That afternoon in shop class, Jamal tried to focus on the simple birdhouse project they were assigned, but his mind kept drifting back to his own plans. When the teacher passed by his table, he glanced down at Jamal's drawings and frowned. "What's this?" Mr. Raines asked, lifting the paper. "It's just an idea," Jamal said hesitantly. The teacher chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Ambitious, sure, but you might want to start smaller. Maybe focus on finishing your assignments before you try to build a real house." The words stung, though they weren't cruel, just dismissive, the way adults sometimes brushed aside a child's dreams. Jamal nodded silently, biting the inside of his cheek to keep from saying anything. When the final bell rang, he walked home alone, his backpack feeling heavier than usual. The laughter of his classmates echoed in his ears, but beneath the sting of their words, something stubborn took root. He wouldn't stop. He couldn't. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, Jamal stood in the backyard. The grass was patchy and uneven, the fence leaning precariously in spots. An old rusted shed sat in the corner, its door hanging crookedly on one hinge. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He dragged out a pile of old wooden planks from the shed, remnants of repairs his grandfather had made years ago. They smelled of dust and age, rough beneath his fingers. With a hammer that had seen better days and a handful of bent nails, he knelt in the dirt and began to work. Each strike of the hammer rang out in the quiet evening air, sharp and defiant. Sweat gathered on his forehead, his thin arms aching with the effort, but he kept going. By the time night fell, a crude wooden frame stood in the center of the yard. Just a few boards nailed together, uneven and splintered, but real. Jamal stood back and looked at it, chest rising and falling. It was small, shaky, and nothing like the drawings in his notebook. But it was the beginning. He smiled to himself, the sound of distant laughter from the neighborhood fading into silence. From the kitchen window, Tanya watched her son standing there in the dark, his hands resting proudly on his hips. Her heart ached with worry and pride all at once. She saw in him something she hadn't seen in years. Not just hope, but determination strong enough to fight back against the world that tried to keep boys like him small. Jamal stayed out there until the stars came out, staring at the simple wooden frame. For the first time, his dream no longer felt like just lines on paper. It felt solid, tangible. He could almost see it, the walls, the windows, the roof, all of it. And in that quiet moment, he promised himself he would build it, no matter how long it took, no matter who laughed. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought of the little house standing in the backyard, waiting for him. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find more wood. He would keep going. He wouldn't stop. It was only the beginning. The next morning dawned gray and cool, the kind of morning that made Jamal want to stay buried under his blanket. But as he stared at the faint outline of the wooden frame he had built the night before, visible through his window in the backyard, he felt a rush of excitement push away the drowsiness. He sprang out of bed, his mind buzzing with plans. He had something real now, even if it was rough and uneven. It was enough to keep him moving. He dressed quickly, grabbing his notebook and pencils, and headed to the kitchen. Tanya was already gone, her half-drunk coffee sitting on the counter, still faintly warm. Jamal ate his breakfast in a hurry and went straight outside. The morning air was damp, carrying the smell of wet grass and earth. The wooden planks he had nailed together the night before looked crude in the daylight, but to Jamal they were perfect. They were proof. He dragged out more of the scrap wood from the old shed and stacked it in a neat pile. There wasn't nearly enough to build what he had drawn in his notebook, but it didn't matter. He could find more. He thought about the stacks of pallets behind the grocery store a few blocks away, the broken furniture piled on curbs for garbage pickup, the houses in the neighborhood where fences were falling apart, and old doors were left leaning against sheds. All of it could become part of his project. That afternoon, after school, Jamal set out with a small red wagon he had borrowed from a neighbor. He started knocking on doors, asking politely if anyone had wood, old furniture, or anything else they didn't want. Most people shook their heads or gave him strange looks, but a few humored him. One older woman let him take apart a broken garden bench, and another neighbor gave him 2 warped planks from an old deck. Jamal dragged his growing haul home piece by piece, the wagon wheels squeaking with every step. But as he worked, the whispers began. The same boys who had laughed at him in the cafeteria passed by his yard and pointed. One of them called out, "Hey, builder boy, you making yourself a tree house? Too bad you don't even got a tree." Their laughter rang out sharp and cruel, echoing across the cracked pavement. Jamal pretended not to hear them, hammering harder as if each strike could drown them out. The teasing didn't stop at school either. Photos began to circulate online, grainy shots of Jamal in his backyard hauling planks, his clothes stained with dirt and sweat. Kids wrote mocking captions under the pictures, calling him names and joking about how he was building a shack to live in since he's so poor. Every time Jamal saw one, it felt like a punch in the stomach. Still, every afternoon he kept at it. He scavenged pallets from the back of stores, dragged home old boards that people left out for trash, and even picked up discarded nails and screws wherever he could find them. His hands were blistered, his muscles sore, but the frame in his yard was slowly taking shape, and that was all that mattered. It was during one of these afternoons, as he struggled to lift a heavy door he had found leaning against a dumpster, that a voice called out behind him. "You planning to build a house with that?" Jamal turned to see an older man leaning against a fence, watching him with an amused expression. He was tall, with a stooped back and gray hair tucked under a faded cap. His clothes smelled faintly of sawdust, and his hands were thick and calloused in a way that spoke of a lifetime of work. "Yes, sir," Jamal said cautiously. The man chuckled. "Name's Henry. Used to be a carpenter back in the day. Been seeing you dragging junk home all week. What's the plan, kid?" Jamal hesitated, unsure if this was another setup for laughter, but there was something in Henry's tone, curiosity, not mockery. He showed him the sketches in his notebook, flipping through the pages nervously as Henry studied them. The older man raised his eyebrows. "Not bad," he said finally. "Lines are a little rough, but you've got the right idea." Jamal felt a surge of pride. "You really think so?" Henry nodded. "I've seen grown men with less sense for structure. Tell you what, I got some old tools I don't use much anymore. You know how to use a handsaw?" That evening, Henry came by with a weathered toolbox. Inside were tools that looked older than Jamal, rusty hammers, worn tape measures, a saw with teeth still sharp despite its age. He showed Jamal how to make cleaner cuts, how to brace beams so they didn't wobble, and how to drive nails straight without bending them. Jamal listened intently, soaking up every word. As the days passed, Henry returned often, watching from the fence or stepping in to lend a hand when something proved too heavy for Jamal alone. He didn't do the work for him, though. "If you want to learn," he said, "you've got to do it yourself." Jamal loved those evenings. Even when the taunts at school grew louder, Even when kids posted videos of themselves laughing outside his fence, he came home, saw the growing frame of his little house, and felt stronger. The sound of Henry's gravelly voice teaching him how to measure angles properly felt like armor against their laughter. One Saturday morning, while most kids were still asleep, Jamal stood in his yard holding a hammer and staring at the skeletal frame of his future house. He could see it in his mind. The walls filled in, the roof sealed tight, a window that looked out at the sky. He imagined a small desk in one corner where he could do his homework, a shelf with books, maybe even a little lamp. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was freedom, a space that belonged to him alone. By late afternoon, he had put up the first full wall. It leaned a little, but it was solid, and when he stepped back, his chest swelled with pride. Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "Looks like a real wall now," he said. "You keep this up, you'll have a house standing before summer's done." But even as he smiled, Jamal knew the laughter hadn't stopped. Marcus and Trent had shown up again, standing outside the fence, tossing empty soda cans into the yard. "You really think this is going to be a house?" Marcus jeered. "Looks like a pile of trash to me." Jamal gripped the hammer tightly but didn't say a word. Instead, he turned back to his work. Every nail he drove in felt like a promise to himself. He would prove them wrong. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the faint glow of the street light filtering through his curtains, he thought of Henry's words and the steady progress he had made. The laughter was still there, but it didn't hurt quite as much anymore. He had taken his first real steps, and nothing, not the teasing, not the long days, not the sore muscles, was going to stop him now. He closed his eyes and pictured the house finished, standing proudly in the yard, and for the first time in a long while, he fell asleep smiling. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Jamal had never known before. Each day felt like a climb, steep and relentless. But every evening, when he stood in his backyard and looked at the skeleton of his little house, he felt the climb was worth it. The frame was no longer just a few crooked boards. With Henry's patient guidance and his own persistence, it had started to take shape, transforming from scraps of wood into something that resembled real walls. It was slow, grueling work. After school, Jamal would rush home, change out of his uniform, and head straight for the backyard. His hands had grown rougher, his palms covered in small calluses that burned every time he gripped the hammer. The skin around his fingernails was raw, stained with dirt that never seemed to wash off. Yet he loved it. The ache in his muscles at the end of the day felt like proof that he was doing something no one believed he could do. Henry continued to drop by most evenings, leaning on the fence with his cap pulled low, offering advice in that steady, gravelly voice of his. Sometimes he'd step in to hold a beam in place or check Jamal's measurements, but mostly he let the boy figure it out himself. Jamal appreciated that. He didn't want this to be anyone else's project. He wanted every nail, every cut, every splinter in his skin to be his own. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. On windy nights, he'd hear the loose boards rattle and wonder if he was building nothing more than a shaky pile of wood that would topple over in the first storm. He'd see his classmates at school, their phones out, sharing videos of his work and laughing at captions that called it Jamal's Junkyard Shack, and his stomach would knot so tightly it hurt. But then he'd come home, see the way the sun hit the unfinished walls in the evening, and the doubt would fade again. Money was the hardest part. Wood, nails, screws, paint, none of it came free. Jamal had already scavenged everything he could from around the neighborhood. The old bench boards and warped fence planks only went so far, and he knew he needed more if he wanted to make the house sturdy. That was when he decided he would earn it himself. He started small, mowing lawns for neighbors who didn't have time to do it themselves. It was spring, and grass grew fast, so there was no shortage of yards that needed attention. Then he added dog walking to his list, and later carrying groceries for Mrs. Thompson down the block. On weekends, he helped Mr. Lopez in his garden, pulling weeds and hauling bags of soil. Every dollar he earned went straight into an old coffee tin labeled House Fund, hidden beneath his bed. He counted it every night before he went to sleep, watching the slow but steady pile of crumpled bills and coins grow. One afternoon, Henry handed Jamal a stack of old shingles. "Salvaged these from a job years ago," he said. "Might be enough for that roof of yours." Jamal stared at the pile, feeling a lump rise in his throat. It wasn't just shingles. It was a reminder that someone believed in him, even if most people didn't. And then there were the small victories. The first time he managed to hang a window frame so it sat square and level. The moment he fitted 2 planks together so perfectly that they didn't even need sanding. Each little step felt monumental, like proof that his hands were learning things his mind already understood. One evening, while he was hammering in the last nails of the second wall, Tanya came outside, wiping her hands on her apron after a long shift. She stood for a long time, watching him work in the fading light, her face unreadable. Jamal kept his head down, nervous about what she might say. Finally, she spoke. "It's really starting to look like something," she said softly. Jamal turned, his chest swelling. "You think so?" She smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I do. I wasn't sure at first, but now I see it." Those words stayed with him for days. He replayed them in his head every time he lifted his hammer, every time his arms felt heavy and his fingers ached. His mother saw it too. That meant more than anything. The neighbors began to notice as well. Mrs. Thompson brought over a can of white paint she hadn't used. Mr. Lopez handed him an old toolbox he'd found in his garage. One evening, a man Jamal didn't even know stopped by the fence and tossed in a bundle of leftover wood slats from his own renovation project. For the first time, people weren't just laughing. They were watching. The biggest surprise came the day a reporter showed up. Jamal was crouched in the dirt, hammering nails into the baseboard when he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. He looked up to see a woman in a neatly pressed shirt holding a notepad and smiling. "You must be Jamal," she said. "I'm writing a story for the local paper. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jamal froze, unsure what to say. He glanced toward Henry, who nodded from where he stood near the fence. The interview was short, but by the next morning, his story was on the front page of the small community section. 13-year-old builds his dream, one board at a time. There was even a picture of him standing proudly in front of his unfinished house, holding his hammer. When Jamal brought the paper to school, a few kids snickered, but others stared at it quietly. By lunch, more people were talking about it, and not all of it was mocking. Some kids even asked him if they could see it in person. That evening, Jamal sat in the backyard after the sun had set, looking at the walls he had built. They were rough, still missing siding in places, but they were real. He leaned back in the grass, feeling the cool air on his face, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't hear laughter when he closed his eyes. He heard nails driving into wood, the sound of progress. Henry came by, sitting down on the edge of the grass beside him. "You're getting there," he said quietly. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." The stars glimmered faintly above them, and Jamal imagined sitting inside his finished house, a lamp glowing by the window, the sound of rain tapping against the roof he'd built himself. It was still far away, but he could almost feel it, as if the future were close enough to touch. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. The night was cool and quiet, with only the faint hum of distant traffic and the chirping of crickets breaking the stillness. Jamal lay in bed, his eyes fixed on the faint silhouette of his little house through the window. It stood there, proud and imperfect, its unfinished walls outlined against the moonlight. He felt an ache of pride just looking at it. Every nail, every beam, every rough plank was proof of what he had done. He closed his eyes and let himself imagine it completed. A small window glowing with warm light, the roof sealed tight against the rain, a desk where he could sit and draw his next dream. It felt so close now that he could almost touch it. But the peace of that night didn't last. The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of his mother calling his name sharply from the backyard. He threw on a shirt and rushed out barefoot, only to stop dead in the doorway. His heart seemed to stop in his chest. His little house was in ruins. One wall was split down the middle, broken beams jutting out like splintered bones. The window frame he had painstakingly leveled now hung crookedly, cracked along one edge. Pieces of wood littered the ground, nails bent and twisted among the wreckage. Jamal felt his stomach twist. He stumbled forward, staring in disbelief. It was as if someone had taken his dream and stomped it into the dirt. "I heard noise last night," Tanya said quietly, her face tight with anger. "I thought it was just raccoons in the trash. I should have checked." Jamal knelt beside the shattered boards, his fingers trembling as he picked up one of the broken pieces. Spray painted across one plank, in sloppy red letters, were the words, "Junk Boy." His chest tightened until it hurt. He didn't need to guess who had done it. Marcus and Trent had been circling his yard for weeks, taunting him every chance they got. He felt something hot sting at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked it back. He couldn't cry. Not now. "I'm sorry, baby," Tanya said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fix it." But Jamal couldn't even answer. He just stared at the wreckage. The sound of those boys laughing in his head felt louder than his mother's voice. All the hours he had spent working, all the bruises, the splinters, the money he had scraped together, gone in a single night of cruelty. That day at school, the whispers were louder than ever. Marcus strutted through the halls like a victor returning from battle, grinning at Jamal from across the cafeteria. Someone had posted pictures of the vandalized house online, and the comments were vicious. They called him delusional, stupid, pathetic. Jamal kept his head down and said nothing, but inside, every word felt like a stone sinking deeper into his chest. When he got home, he didn't go to the backyard. He couldn't bear to see it. He sat on the edge of his bed instead, staring at his notebook full of blueprints and wondering if it had all been a mistake. Maybe Mr. Raines was right. Maybe he really had reached too far. That evening, Henry came by calling his name from the gate. Jamal didn't answer. He heard the old man's footsteps crunch on the gravel, heard him stop and swear under his breath when he saw the damage. After a long silence, Henry's voice came low but steady. "Come out here, son." Jamal dragged himself to the door and stepped out. Henry stood beside the wreckage, his hands on his hips, his weathered face stern but calm. "You gonna let them win?" he asked simply. Jamal looked away. "It's over. I can't fix this. It's all ruined." Henry snorted. "Ruined? It's wood and nails. You can replace those. What you can't replace is quitting. That sticks." Jamal didn't answer. He stared at the broken wall and felt something heavy in his chest. "I don't even know where to start." Henry stepped closer, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Start where you always do, one board at a time." Jamal wanted to argue, but Henry's grip was steady and there was something unshakable in his voice. "I'll help you," the old man continued, "but you're the one who's going to do the work. You hear me?" Word of what happened spread through the neighborhood faster than Jamal expected. By the next evening, people began to show up. First Mrs. Thompson, then Mr. Lopez, then others he barely knew. They carried scrap wood, nails, paint cans. One man from down the street brought a bundle of 2x4s tied together with rope. "We saw the paper," Mrs. Thompson said, smiling kindly. "You've worked too hard to give up now." Even some of the kids who had laughed at him before showed up, awkward and quiet, asking if they could help. Jamal hesitated at first, but Henry nodded to him. "Let 'em. You'd be surprised how fast things can change." And so they worked. The air buzzed with the sound of hammers, saws, and voices. Under Henry's guidance, Jamal and his helpers tore down the broken wall and rebuilt it, this time stronger and straighter than before. His mother brought out lemonade and sandwiches for everyone, watching with pride as her son led the effort, measuring cuts and guiding where each beam should go. By the end of the weekend, the damage was gone. The house stood taller, sturdier, as if it had absorbed the strength of every hand that had worked on it. Jamal stepped back, sweat dripping down his forehead, and looked at it with new eyes. What had felt like the end just days ago now felt like the beginning of something bigger. That night, lying in bed, he thought about how quickly everything had changed. Just a few days earlier, he'd felt alone, humiliated, ready to give up. Now, his house was stronger than ever, and for the first time he didn't feel like he was carrying the dream alone. He had help. He had people rooting for him. As he drifted off to sleep, he realized something. The boys who had torn his house apart hadn't destroyed his dream. They'd given it roots. What he was building now wasn't just a house. It was proof. Proof to everyone who laughed, proof to himself, proof to the world that even if they knocked him down, he could stand up again. And this time, he would not be shaken. The morning sun crept slowly over the rooftops, painting the sky in hues of gold and pale pink. Jamal stood barefoot in the grass of his backyard, staring at the house that had risen from what once was nothing but a dream and a pile of scrap wood. It was no longer a fragile frame or a shaky skeleton. It was sturdy now, its walls strong and upright, its roof lined neatly with shingles Henry had taught him to place. It wasn't finished yet, but the hardest parts were behind him. He could see it clearly now. Soon, he would stand inside his own house, not just as a boy who dared to dream, but as someone who had made that dream real. The neighborhood had changed its tune. Where there had once been laughter and mocking, there was now quiet admiration. Neighbors, who once barely looked his way, now paused at the fence to watch his progress, offering scraps of lumber or leftover paint. Even those who had done nothing more than jeer from a distance seemed to keep their distance now, as if realizing their words no longer held weight. Jamal felt it every time he picked up his hammer. He wasn't just building for himself anymore. People were watching, and some of them were even believing. Henry, of course, remained his constant guide. That old man was there nearly every evening, steady and unshakable, leaning on the fence and correcting Jamal's angles with a quiet word or stepping forward when two sets of hands were needed instead of one. Together, they installed the door, a salvaged piece from Mrs. Thompson's cousin's renovation job, and fitted it perfectly into its frame. Jamal ran his fingers over the smooth edge of it, unable to stop himself from grinning. It wasn't new, but it was his. Inside, they began laying out the simple floor, hammering each plank into place until the entire room smelled of fresh-cut wood. Jamal could already imagine himself there at night, curled up on a cot with a book, a small lamp glowing beside him. He wanted to paint the walls, to make them bright and warm, but he didn't have the money for paint yet. That didn't matter. He knew he'd find a way. He always did. The sense of progress drove him harder than ever. After school, he barely even stopped inside the house for a snack before rushing to the backyard. He worked late into the evenings, his hands aching, his body tired, but his heart light. Tanya watched him from the kitchen window, her face softening with each passing day. Sometimes she came out with a plate of food, urging him to take a break. He would sit with her on the porch steps, dirt streaking his arms, sawdust clinging to his clothes, and listen as she talked about how proud she was of him. Those moments fueled him as much as anything else. The local paper's article hadn't gone unnoticed. It sparked something bigger than Jamal ever imagined. One afternoon, as he was hammering the final nails into a section of siding, a car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a news crew, their cameras glinting in the sunlight. The reporter introduced herself as someone from the local TV station, and before Jamal could fully process what was happening, they were setting up equipment in his backyard. He answered their questions nervously, shifting from foot to foot as the cameras rolled. He told them how it all began, how he'd been inspired by videos online and decided he could build something of his own. He explained how Henry had helped him, how the neighbors had joined in, how even the setback of sabotage hadn't stopped him. When they asked him why he did it, he looked straight into the camera and said simply, "Because I wanted to prove to myself that I could." The segment aired that evening, and by the next day, Jamal was something of a local celebrity. Teachers who had once barely acknowledged him in class congratulated him in the hallways. Kids who had mocked him weeks earlier now approached him hesitantly, their voices softer, some even asking if they could help out. He let them. Not because he needed their help, but because he understood something now. The house wasn't just his anymore. It belonged, in a way, to everyone who had been a part of it, whether they'd nailed the board in place or simply watched from the fence, marveling at what he was doing. The work sped up after that. With extra hands, they finished the remaining walls and secured the roof completely. Henry helped him hook up a small solar panel that powered a single bulb and a simple outlet inside the house, salvaged from a thrift store. Jamal stood inside that night, flicking the switch on and off in awe, laughing quietly to himself at the glow that filled the little room. By the end of the week, the house was done. It wasn't large, just enough for a small bed, a narrow table, and a chair, but it was solid and warm, the kind of place where you could sit and feel at peace. Jamal stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, and for a long time he didn't move. He just looked around, breathing it in. It smelled of wood and fresh paint, the scent of work well done. Tanya came out, her eyes wide as she stepped inside. She ran her hands along the walls, touched the windowsill, and finally turned to him. "You really did it," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You really built this." Jamal nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. That night, he slept in his house for the first time. He lay on the cot beneath a blanket, the faint hum of the solar light above him, and stared at the ceiling he had nailed together with his own hands. Through the small window, he could see the stars glittering faintly. He felt a kind of peace he'd never known before, the weight of every struggle and every insult melting away. The recognition didn't stop there. A larger newspaper picked up his story, and soon a clip of the TV interview began spreading online. People from other towns, even other states, sent messages to his social media account, congratulating him, asking for advice, telling him how inspired they were by what he'd done. He thought back to that first day, when he'd stood in the backyard staring at an empty patch of grass with only his sketches and a dream. Everything he'd endured, the laughter, the sabotage, the exhaustion, it had led here. Jamal sat at his little table, his notebook open in front of him, already sketching his next project. His fingers moved quickly, sure and steady. The house was done, but he wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He was no longer just the boy who dreamed. He was the boy who built. And now, there was nothing stopping him. The morning after Jamal spent his first night in the house felt different in ways he couldn't quite explain. He woke with sunlight filtering through the small window he'd installed himself, the soft glow spilling across the modest wooden walls. For a moment, he simply lay there, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the quiet hum of life outside. The distant murmur of traffic, a bird chirping on the fence post, the faint laughter of kids on their way to school. It was unlike any morning he'd ever known. This was his space, built with his own hands from the ground up. He'd dreamt of this moment so many times, but now that it was real, it felt even better than he had imagined. He slipped out of bed, bare feet on the wooden floor, and looked around. Everything was simple. A small bed tucked into one corner, a table with his sketchbook and pencils on top, a single chair. The solar light overhead still glowed faintly from the night before, proof that he had figured out how to wire it properly. He smiled to himself, switching it off and throwing open the door to step outside. His mother was standing at the kitchen window, and when she saw him emerge from the little house grinning, she waved. He waved back, his chest swelling with pride. Word of his house had spread even further overnight. The video clip from the local news had been shared hundreds of times, then thousands. By midday, Jamal's story had been picked up by national websites, his picture plastered under headlines that read things like, 13-year-old builds his own home from scratch, and boy turns backyard dream into reality. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages from strangers, comments of congratulations, and even invitations to join youth programs for aspiring engineers and architects. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Kids from across the country began writing to him, sending messages that said things like, "I want to build something like you did," and "You made me believe I can do more than people say I can." Jamal read each one carefully, answering when he could, amazed that something he had done in his backyard could reach so far beyond the fences of his own neighborhood. At school, things were different now, too. The same kids who had laughed at him weeks ago now approached him with cautious smiles, some even apologizing for what they'd said. Marcus and Trent, who had once spray-painted "Junk Boy" on his wall, kept their distance, their usual bravado gone. Jamal didn't seek revenge or even confrontation. He had moved past all that. He had something better now, proof that he didn't need their approval or their friendship. Still, their silence was its own kind of victory. One afternoon, his teacher, Mr. Raines, stopped him after class. "I read about you in the paper," he said, holding Jamal's gaze with a thoughtful expression. I have to admit, I didn't think you'd see it through, but you proved me wrong. You should be proud of yourself." It wasn't much, but hearing it felt like closing a chapter. His house became more than just a personal space. Younger kids from the neighborhood began stopping by after school, peeking over the fence or asking if they could see inside. Jamal didn't turn them away. He welcomed them in, showed them the walls, the roof, even how the solar light worked. He explained the tools he used and let them hold a hammer or measure a plank, their faces lighting up with fascination. They reminded him of himself at the start, curious, uncertain, but full of potential they didn't yet see. One day, his younger cousin, Malik, visited. Malik had always been shy and quiet, spending most of his time indoors with his video games. But when he saw Jamal's house, his eyes widened. "You really made this?" he asked in awe. "Every inch of it," Jamal replied. Malik followed him inside, running his fingers along the smooth walls. Do you think I could build something too?" Jamal grinned. "I know you could. I'll help you." That night, Malik sat with Jamal at the little table in his house, and together they sketched out a small project, a simple birdhouse to start. Jamal taught him how to measure, how to think about space and structure. It was small, but it felt like planting a seed. Soon, it wasn't just Malik. Other kids began asking Jamal for help on their own projects. Some wanted to build skateboard ramps, others dreamed of tree houses or simple furniture. Jamal started dedicating time after school to guiding them, explaining what Henry had once explained to him. He found himself echoing the old man's steady patience, realizing he had gone from being a student to a teacher without even noticing. Henry watched all of this with quiet pride. One evening, he stopped by as usual, leaning against the fence while Jamal worked with Malik on sanding a board. When Malik ran off to fetch another tool, Henry chuckled. "Looks like you've got your own apprentices now." Jamal smiled, glancing up. "Guess I do." Henry nodded slowly. "That's how it goes. Someone helps you climb, then you turn around and help the next one." In those words, Jamal saw the full circle of what had happened. He remembered the nights of exhaustion, the days of mockery, the crushing moment when he'd found his house destroyed. If he had quit then, if he had let the voices around him drown out his determination, none of this would have happened. The house itself was just wood and nails, but the journey, the persistence, that was what truly mattered. By the end of the school year, Jamal was invited to speak at a community center event. The idea terrified him at first, but he accepted. On the day of the event, he stood nervously at a podium in front of a room full of kids and parents, his palms sweating. He looked out at them, faces young and old, curious and expectant, and took a deep breath. He told them everything. How it started with a simple sketch, how people laughed, how he scraped together materials, earned money mowing lawns, learned from Henry, and endured when it felt impossible. He told them about the night he'd found his house wrecked and how the neighbors came together to help him rebuild. And finally, he told them about the feeling of standing inside that little house when it was done, the knowledge that he had built it with his own hands. By the time he finished, the room was silent, and then it erupted in applause. Parents clapped, kids whispered excitedly to each other, and Jamal stood there, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and disbelief. Afterward, several parents came up to him, thanking him for inspiring their children. Later that evening, as he sat at his desk inside the house, Jamal reflected on it all. He glanced at the photo pinned above his table, a picture from the newspaper showing him in front of his half-built house, hammer in hand. Beside it, he had pinned a newer photo, him and Malik, grinning with the birdhouse they had built together. He realized then that his little house was no longer just his dream. It had become a beacon, a symbol that if one determined boy in a modest backyard could build something like this, then maybe any one could build something of their own. Outside, the sky darkened and the stars appeared, glittering faintly above. Jamal switched on his solar light, the glow filling his small but perfect room. He opened his notebook again, flipping to a fresh page. His pencil hovered over the blank sheet for a moment before he began sketching, this time not just for himself, but for everyone who might one day follow his path. He didn't know what his future held exactly, architecture school perhaps, or bigger projects, but he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. He looked around at the wooden walls, the window he had cut himself, the roof above his head that had weathered storms already, and smiled. His dream had become real, and now it would light the way for others. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more inspiring stories, and don't forget to share this video